Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. Not 3 times. The Rules of the Haunted Cabin. The email landed in my inbox at 3 a.m. Its subject line simple yet cryptic, an escape like no other. Groggy from a restless sleep, I almost dismissed it as spam, but curiosity won out. The sender was an old college friend, Sarah. We hadn't spoken in years. The body of the email read, "Hey, Mike, I know we haven't caught up in a while, but I'm organizing a weekend getaway at this amazing cabin I found. It's remote, surrounded by nature, and here's the kicker, supposedly haunted. A little adventure, right? We'll be there from Friday to Sunday. I've invited a few others, so it'll be like old times. Think of it as an escape from the grind. Hope you can make it. I'll send the location if you're in. P.S. There are some rules, but don't worry, it's all part of the fun." Something about the email fell off. Maybe it was the strange timing or the mention of rules. Still, I needed a break. Work had been suffocating, and the thought of reconnecting with old friends felt like a lifeline. I replied, "Count me in." Friday arrived quickly. By the time I reached the meeting point, a dirt road intersection on the edge of a sprawling forest, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. Sarah was already there, leaning against her car, waving enthusiastically. "Mike," she called, her voice bright but her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. "Hey, Sarah." I gave her a quick hug. "So, where's this famous cabin?" She grinned. "You see, let's wait for the others." One by one, they arrived. Chris, the jokester from our college days. Emily, quiet and observant. And Raj, ever the skeptic. It felt like a mini reunion, though the energy was subdued. The cabin, when we finally reached it, was a picture-perfect slice of rustic charm. Nestled in a clearing, it was surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the evening breeze. A wraparound porch creaked under our feet as we unloaded our bags. "All right," Sarah announced once we were inside, her tone suddenly serious. "Before we get too comfortable, we need to go over the rules." Chris snorted. "Rules? What is this? Summer camp?" "Just listen," Sarah said sharply, silencing him. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket and read aloud. 1. Knock 3 times before entering any room. 2. Do not leave the cabin after midnight. 3. If you hear a knock on the door after dark, do not answer it. 4. Keep the windows closed at all times. 5. If you see someone outside who looks like one of us, ignore them." The air in the room grew heavier with each rule. "What the hell, Sarah?" Raj finally said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Is this some kind of prank?" "No prank," Sarah replied, her expression grim. "These rules came with the cabin. The owner was very specific. Break them, and..." She trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. Emily hugged herself, glancing nervously at the darkening windows. "This isn't funny." "It's not supposed to be," Sarah said. "Look, I know it's weird, but I promise it's worth it. Just follow the rules, and we'll have an amazing weekend." Reluctantly, we agreed. What else could we do? The nearest town was miles away, and the idea of turning back seemed absurd. Night fell quickly, the forest outside cloaked in impenetrable darkness. We gathered in the living room, the warm glow of the fireplace doing little to ease the unease settling over us. Chris tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even he seemed unnerved. Raj argued that the rules were just a scare tactic to add to the cabin's haunted allure. Emily, meanwhile, barely spoke, her eyes flitting nervously to the windows. Then came the first knock. 3 sharp raps echoed through the cabin, startling us all. "Who the hell is that?" Chris whispered, his earlier bravado gone. Sarah stood, her face pale. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her voice trembled. She walked to the door and peered through the peephole. "No one's there," she said, stepping back quickly. "Then who knocked?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. We tried to shake it off, attributing the sound to the wind or maybe an animal, but the unease lingered, creeping into the corners of our minds like a cold mist. By midnight, we decided to call it a night. Sarah handed out the room keys, reminding us once more of the rules. "Remember to knock," she said. I climbed the creaky staircase to my assigned room, the paper-thin walls amplifying every sound. I stopped in front of the door, feeling ridiculous as I knocked 3 times before entering. The room was small but cozy, with a single window overlooking the forest. I locked it, drew the curtains, and slid into bed. exhaustion tugging at my eyelids. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence was too loud, the darkness too heavy. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, 3 faint knocks on my window. The 3 knocks on the window jolted me upright, heart hammering. The sound was faint, deliberate, and impossibly out of place. The window was on the 2nd floor. For a moment, I sat there frowning in the dark, staring at the drawn curtains. My mind raced with possibilities, a bird, the wind, my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The knocks came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark. The screen glowed harshly, and I checked the time, 12:17 a.m. I considered texting Sarah or one of the others but hesitated. What would I even say? Instead, I gripped the edge of the blanket, willing myself to stay put. Sarah had made the rules clear: don't open the windows, don't engage. Whatever was outside wasn't supposed to be acknowledged. The knocking stopped. For the next hour, I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the silence. Occasionally, the cabin creaked, the forest groaned, but the knocks didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of voices downstairs. For a moment, the events of the night before felt distant, like a bad dream, but the unease in my chest told me otherwise. Downstairs, everyone was gathered in the kitchen. Sarah was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Chris and Raj argued about something. Emily sat at the table. Tail end was drawn, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "You look like hell," Chris said when I walked in, his usual smirk in place. "Rough night." "You could say that," I muttered, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Say," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. Her knocking on my window?" Chris snorted. "You guys are seriously spooked over some bumps in the night. This place is old. Houses make noise." "It wasn't just noise," Emily snapped, her voice trembling. "It was 3 knocks, just like the rules said." The room fell silent. Raj cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Okay, let's think this through. It's probably animals." "Right, a branch hitting the window. There's a logical explanation." "Sure," Sarah said, but her tone was unconvincing. "Let's just keep following the rules." "Okay, no harm in being cautious." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the air was heavy with unspoken fears. We explored the surrounding forest, sticking together as we wandered along overgrown trails and marveled at the towering pines. The daylight helped ease some of the tension, but the cabin loomed in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. By evening, the unease had returned. The fireplace crackled in the living room as we played cards and tried to laugh off our nerves. Sarah insisted on locking every window and door before nightfall, double-checking each one. Chris, of course, couldn't resist making jokes. "What happens if we break a rule? Does the ghost write us a strongly worded letter?" "Don't test it," Sarah said sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. The second night was worse. It started around 11:30 p.m. I was in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, when the cabin went silent. Not just quiet silent. The hum of the wind, the creak of the floorboards, even the distant hoot of an owl, all of it stopped, as if the world had been muted. And then came the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I stared at the doorknob, the air around me growing colder by the second. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely steady. No answer, just 3 more knocks, slow and deliberate. I thought of the rules, knock 3 times before entering any room, but I was already inside, and I hadn't heard anyone knock before they approached. "Sarah," I called again. "Chris, is this some kind of joke?" Still nothing. The knocks came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped out of bed, backing into the far corner of the room. My phone trembled in my hand, and I considered texting the group, but as I opened the messaging app, I frowned. See, from the gap beneath the door, I saw it, a shadow. Somewhere something was standing outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. At breakfast, it was clear I wasn't the only one who'd had a rough night. Emily looked even more shaken than before, and Raj kept glancing nervously at the windows. Only Chris seemed unfazed, though his jokes had lost some of their edge. "I heard it too," Emily said finally, breaking the tense silence. "At my door this time." "Same here," I admitted. "It knocked 3 times, but when I looked, There was no one there, just a shadow. Raj rubbed his temples. This is getting ridiculous. There has to be an explanation. Maybe we should leave, Emily said, her voice small. No, Sarah's voice was firm. We stick it out. We just have to follow the rules. They're there for a reason. Have you noticed something? Chris cut in, his voice unusually serious. It's escalating. First the windows, now the doors. What's next? No one had an answer. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah gathered us in the living room. We need to stay together tonight, she said. No splitting up, no wandering off. For once, no one argued. The hours dragged on, the oppressive weight of anticipation making every creak and rustle unbearable. Around midnight, the knocking started again, faint but persistent. Knock, knock, knock. It came from all around us, the windows, the doors, even the walls. The sound echoed through the cabin, relentless and suffocating. Don't answer, Sarah whispered, her face pale, no matter what. Then came the voice. Let me in. It was soft at first, almost pleading. A woman's voice, distant but clear. Let me in, it repeated, louder this time. Emily clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. Ross stared at the floor, his lips moving in silent prayer. Chris, for once, was silent, his bravado shattered. Don't listen, Sarah hissed. Ignore it. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. The voice became a scream, echoing in every corner of the cabin. Let me in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed the screaming was almost worse than the noise itself. We sat there in the living room, too stunned to speak. The fire crackled weakly, its warm glow doing little to push back the suffocating darkness that seemed to press in on us. Did anyone else hear that? Emily finally whispered, her voice shaking. Of course we heard it, Chris snapped, his usual humor replaced by fear. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. This isn't normal. This isn't a game. What the hell is happening? Sarah. All eyes turned to Sarah. She sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I told you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to follow the rules. If we don't, she trailed off, her eyes darting to the windows. If we don't, what? Raj demanded, his voice rising. What happens if we break the rules? You keep saying this like you know something. Sarah, what aren't you telling us? Sarah's lips trembled, and for the first time since we arrived, I saw fear in her eyes. This isn't the first time I've been here, she admitted. We all stared at her, stunned into silence. What do you mean? And at the first time, I asked, breaking the tension. Sarah sighed, burying her face in her hands before looking up at us. A few years ago, I came here with another group, friends from work. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just like this, but we didn't take the rules seriously. The room felt colder as she spoke, her words hanging heavy in the air. What happened? Emily whispered. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. We ignored the rules. We thought they were just there to scare us. Someone opened the door after dark. Someone broke a window. And then, people started disappearing. Disappearing? Raj's voice cracked. What does that mean? Did they leave? Or, they didn't leave? Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. They were taken, one by one. I barely made it out alive. The room fell deathly quiet. Why the hell would you come back here? Then, Chris exploded, his face flushed with anger. And why would you bring us? Because I need to know, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I need to understand what this place is, what it wants. And I thought, maybe if we follow the rules, we could survive this time. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. The weight of her revelation settled over us, suffocating and inescapable. The next day, we tried to act normal, but the cracks were showing. Sarah's confession had shaken all of us, and no one could pretend otherwise. We spent the morning outside, walking aimlessly through the forest. The towering trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches casting jagged shadows on the ground. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. Do you think she's telling the truth? Raj asked quietly as we walked. She seemed pretty convincing last night, I replied, and after everything that's happened, I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. Raj shook his head. This whole thing feels like a nightmare. I just want to get out of here. Then why don't we? Chris interjected, overhearing us. Pack our stuff and leave. Forget the rules. Forget the cabin. Just go. Because it's not that simple, Sarah said, appearing behind us. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Once you've entered the cabin, you can leave until the weekend is over. It's part of the deal. What deal? Chris snapped. Sarah didn't answer. As the sun set, the tension in the cabin grew unbearable. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all terrified of what the night would bring. This time, we stayed together in the living room, determined not to split up. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. We just need to make it one more night, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. If we follow the rules, we'll be fine. But no one believed her. Around midnight, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the front door this time, loud and insistent. Don't answer it, Sarah whispered, her face pale. No kidding, Chris muttered, his bravado masking his fear. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. And then, we heard the voice again. Let me in. This time, it was different. The voice was male, deep and familiar. Chris, is that you? Chris frowned, his eyes wide. Don't listen to it, Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. But it sounds like it's not real, she shouted, her voice breaking. The voice outside laughed. Hello, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Let me in, it said again, mocking. I'm cold, don't you want to help me? Chris stood, trembling, his gaze locked on the door. What if it is real? What if someone's out there? It's not, Sarah said, her grip tightening on his arm. Don't open that door. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came a new sound, footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Each creak of the wooden boards made my heart race. And then I saw it. Through the gap in the curtains, a figure moved in the darkness. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured, but as it passed by the window, I could have sworn it looked at me. And it was smiling. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. There's someone out there, I whispered. Don't look, Sarah said, her voice urgent. Whatever you do, don't acknowledge it. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin, growing louder and more aggressive. The figure passed by the windows again and again, its movements growing more erratic. Let me in, it whispered, its voice seeping through the walls like poison. The lights flickered, and the fire sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, from the far corner of the room, came the sound of knocking. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks from the corner of the room frowned us in place. The air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural chill, and the darkness felt alive, shifting, pressing against us. Who's there? Chris stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Don't ask, Sarah hissed. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes darting toward the shadows. Don't acknowledge it, just stay quiet. But the knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow, deliberate, and far too close. My throat was dry, my chest tight as I scanned the room. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt a presence as something watching us, something waiting. The voice returned, low and chilling. Let me in. It came from the shadows in the corner this time. Not the door, not the windows. The same voice, but now it seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I can't take this anymore, Chris shouted, bolting toward the door. Chris, no, Sarah screamed, but he was already pulling it open. The moment the door swung wide, the air seemed to collapse inward. A cold, rushing wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the last flickers of the fireplace. The darkness outside wasn't just an absence of light, it was tangible, like a void spilling into the room. Chris stood frowning in the doorway, his body rigid, his eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the blackness behind him. Chris, Rush called out, his voice trembling. Chris turned slowly, his face blank, his eyes glassy. They're here, he said, his voice flat, lifeless. Before anyone could react, something yanked him backward into the dark. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and Chris was gone. Panic erupted. We need to leave, Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. No, Sarah shouted. You can't leave. Don't you get it? We're trapped here until sunrise. If we step outside, we're dead. What was that? Raji demanded, his voice cracking. What took him? Sarah didn't answer. The knocks returned, louder and faster this time, coming from every surface doors, the windows, the walls. Knock, knock, knock.
Stick to the rules, Sarah said, her voice trembling. We have to stick to the rules. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity. The knocking never stopped. It echoed through the cabin, relentless, accompanied by whispers that seemed to seep into my mind. You can't stay there forever, the voice said, soft and taunting. Emily broke first. I can't do this, she cried, bolting for the back door. Emily, don't! I yelled, chasing after her. But she was too fast. She flung open the door, stepping into the night. For a moment, nothing happened. She turned back to us, her face streaked with tears. See, it's fine, there's nothing out. Something dark and massive moved behind her, too fast to see clearly. Emily's scream was cut short as she was pulled into the shadows. The door slammed shut, and the knocking grew louder, more frenzied. Now it was just me, Sarah, and Raj. We huddled together in the living room, our backs to the fireplace, our eyes darting to every corner of the room. What do we do? Raj whispered. We wait, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. We just have to make it until sunrise. The hours stretched on. The knocking continued, joined by scratching at the windows and faint, distant screams that sounded like Chris and Emily. They're trying to break us, Sarah said, her voice hollow. By 4 a.m., Raj was gone. I didn't see him leave, I only realized he was missing when I turned and found the spot next to me empty. He's gone, I whispered. Sarah didn't respond. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused. We're not going to make it, are we? I asked. She didn't answer. The cabin groaned, the walls trembling as the knocks reached a deafening crescendo. The voice returned, louder than ever. Let me in. The final hours were a blur. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was streaming through the curtains. The knocking had stopped. The cabin was silent. Sarah? I called out, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. I found her sitting on the porch, staring out at the forest. She didn't turn when I approached. They're gone, she said softly. What happened to them? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They're part of it now, she said, just like the others. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. We left the cabin in silence, walking back to our cars without a word. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive, but the memories of the past 2 nights clung to me like a shadow. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing on the porch, watching us. And then they raised a hand and knocked 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.